Matt Mitrik on GitHub with Azure Boards.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello, I'm your host, Jeffrey Palermo. You can go to www.azuredevops.show for past shows and show notes. Our guest today is Matt Mitrik. Matt is a senior program manager on the Azure DevOps Services Team working on Azure Boards, and he's been working with ALM and DevOps tools for roughly 13 years. Matt, is that right? How have you been?
I'm great. Thanks, Jeffrey. Yeah, this is it's going on 13 years for me now. So yeah, it's been quite a while in this space, but it's been good. So no complaints.
Yeah, well, that's a long time. But you know, the listeners of this podcast are shipping software using Microsoft technologies. You've been at Microsoft for a long time, but for those not familiar with you, what's your background been? How did you land at Microsoft, and how have you ended up on this particular team?
Yeah, that's a good question. I joined Microsoft in 2006. I actually was my first full-time gig out of college, and I loved it, and I've been here ever since. My journey started actually in the TFS team, which was our team foundation server, our first kind of venture into what would become DevOps, right? And I started off in what we called migration tools at that time, helping people get from the previous generation of version control and work tracking tools. So your Visual Source Safe, if you remember that, or some of the competitor things like Rational Clear Case, and even open source tools like Subversion and CVS before that. And so I helped build a lot of tooling to get people moving from their old systems into TFS. And then kind of as that, as we matured our offering with TFS, I moved into the version control space and worked there for a lot of years as a PM on the team. And then, it started to get really interesting probably in the 2012, 2013 timeframe when Git was blowing up, right? It really changed the world in terms of how developers were tracking their source code. And we knew that we had to do something. And, Git became this thing, well, we could either fight it or join it. And we joined it, right? And we embraced that and brought it into our product and built an offering around that. And, made that a full-fledged part of TFS, and at the time, TFS and DSTS. And, now we call that Azure Repos. And then, probably about 9 months ago, there was this acquisition deal at Microsoft, buying GitHub. You probably heard about that, little bit of money we spent on that. And it became this, new part of our DevOps family, right? And so we wanted to make GitHub a, full piece of Azure DevOps, and making sure that all integrated really well together. And then I had an opportunity to kind of move over from the Azure Repos side of the world to the Azure Boards team, and help build that integration between GitHub and Azure Boards. And that's kind of what I'm working on right now. And it's been, for probably I've said about almost the last 9 months, that's been my focus. So kind of that's the journey for me so far.
Awesome. Well, last week we interviewed Phil Hack, who was one of the leaders in GitHub, talking about how they actually do DevOps. So that was a good show. But you're right. The integration with GitHub, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen moving forward. And we have the word that, okay, GitHub is strategically planned to be the premier version control hosting offering. But what works now? I mean, obviously any Git repository works now with Azure Boards and Azure Pipelines. But what specifically isn't where you want it to be? That's the big focus.
Right. Yeah. So a good thing to start with is kind of what do we have right now, right? Because not everybody, I think, is familiar with that. And it was just in late December, actually, we released the initial integration tools that we have in this space. And so our first experience, we said, is we need to make it easy for people to get traceability between their work and their code, right? In that scenario, you said, hey, we want to bring, GitHub and make that a full part of the boards and pipeline story as part of the DevOps suite. We said, well, we've already got this integration with Azure Pipelines and GitHub, right? We've had that for some time. We have this, offer that's out there for open source projects that can get free pipeline usage, and which is awesome in my opinion. I think it's a deal that teams shouldn't be passing up. But
yeah,
we said, well, we need to bring Azure Boards into that fully. What does that look like? And we said, well, kind of the first experience that we want to do is make sure that you can get between your code and your work, right? And so what does that mean? If you think about how teams, and developers that are using Git are tracking their work, you really just have to look at a few Git commit messages and go to any GitHub repo, and you'll see this where people have this mention syntax that we call it, right? Where in your commit message, you just type, this fixes bug, or issue, and then a pound sign or a hashtag, and then the ID of that thing, right? And that's just this convention-based approach that, teams use. And GitHub has built experiences around that where you mention that issue in your commit message. And then when you go to the web and you're looking at the commit details, you can see that mention is a link to the issue in the same project, right? And so this has kind of become the standard way of tracking this code goes with this work. And you see that both in your commits and pull requests, right? And it's really common for people to list, well, this is the issue that this is fixing. Or it's maybe an issue is tracking a new feature, not necessarily a bug. Mm-hmm. So it's implementing this. And we said, well, that's our first experience, right? We need to just go after that. We need to make that very natural for Git developers so that they can use that same model of, you're writing your code, you're doing that locally, right? You commit your changes. If at the time you're committing those changes, you want to associate that with the piece of work that is tracking those code changes, you could do that, right? If you would prefer to do that, or you also want to do that later in your process when you've created your topic branch and you published it to GitHub and you're creating a pull request now, you mention it in your pull request, and now that becomes associated to that work as well. And so that's where we're at. We've added the capability to Azure Boards that allows you to link your GitHub repos to your Azure Boards projects. And once you've done that, then you can use our mention syntax. And so because we're still external to GitHub, we have a slightly different syntax. So you type AB for Azure Boards and then a pound sign, and then the ID. So it's Azure Boards number 123, for example. And that would, link that work item to Azure Boards from GitHub. And so that's the offering that we have right now. And it works great. We're seeing a really healthy amount of adoption. We're really happy with it. We've seen some open source projects pick it up, as well as, a lot of private development teams. And so they're using this as kind of a way to, get the best of what GitHub has to offer in terms of version control and, all of your coding features. And you get the maturity and all the features that Azure Boards offers, in terms of, backlogs and, boards and sprint boards and dashboards and all of those things as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
So with Azure Boards, if people are used to using Azure Boards with Azure Repos, they put in the hash sign and it links it up directly. If they just use GitHub, is it automatic? What's the process for if someone is either pulling in a Git repository, or would you even recommend moving from Azure Repos to GitHub?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think this is one of the best things about Git, right? Is it's so portable, right? Yeah. You could move from Azure Repos to GitHub and back, and you're not losing any of the core source control data, right? Mm-hmm. All of your commits are intact. You'll have all of that history forever, all of your branches. It's very easy to move between Git hosting services. And that's absolutely true between Azure Repos and GitHub. The one thing that you do, kind of, I'll use the word lose loosely. I've got air quotes up here. I guess the listeners can see that, but is kind of the extra metadata, the things like you've got your pull requests, right? It's not really a thing that you can move between Azure Repos and GitHub. But there is a lot of important data there, right? People want to go back to that and see, why did we make this change this way? But one of the really great things is it would be easy for you to kind of archive a project in Azure Repos and say, that was at this point, maybe we hit some major release, we make a cut over and we say, we're going to move over to GitHub now and track over here. And there's no reason you can't leave that old repo data behind and, use it and keep those links and relationships between Azure Repos and Azure Boards, and then kind of move over to GitHub and get all of the power and, features that GitHub has and a huge ecosystem, which is just amazingly impressive, what GitHub has done in that space, and use all of that with Azure Boards and pipelines as well. So I would say, there is a cost in terms of moving. But what our goal right now, and my team specifically in the Azure Board space, is to make sure that there isn't any loss in terms of the capability, in terms of the integration between those systems, so that all of those workflows you can do of associating your code and your pull requests and mentioning work items, and querying for links and things like that. Those are all features we want to be able to provide in the GitHub space.
Yeah. So the pull request is one of those features which technically obviously belongs somewhere, but it doesn't. You don't really think of, the pull request belongs to the Git technology, and it's really so much about communication with the team and communication around the work. So where does that fit in? Is a pull request situated with the work in Azure Boards, or is the pull request go with wherever the Git repository goes?
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting question. I would say technically, behind the scenes, the way that it works is it needs to be really close. The pull request needs to be very close to the code, because fundamentally it starts off as, I like to think of it as like a diff on steroids, right? It's giving you this contextual diff of here's a set of changes and how it relates. How it changed over time as people were giving feedback. But then you're right, there's the discussion, and the discussion is about the work as much as it is about the code. So while it technically lives very close to the code, that's the experience that we want to provide, is making sure that the work features are tightly integrated. So I'll give you an example, right? I talked about what we have today. You can mention your work items as part of the pull request. Now, if I dig in there a little bit, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, a pull request has a title. If you mention your work item in the title, we'll see that. We have, our integration is event driven. So, we see an event happen, a new pull request gets created in GitHub. Oh, it mentions the work item. Let's create the link, right? That's the workflow. Same thing with the pull request description. If you've got your description and you're describing the work that's done here, right? Here's the code that does these things. Mention the work items there, then you'll get that link as well. But what about in conversation, right? This happens all the time where people say, oh, this seems related to this other work. And today, if you went out, you don't have that integration. We don't actually look at the conversation around the code for related mentions. But that's actually something we're actively working on right now, because we recognize that is as much a part as that integration. That conversation about the work needs to have that linkage to the work. And so the feature that we'll have is using that same syntax, you'll be able to mention any work item as part of any discussion on a pull request. So, if I have a question and say, hey, this looks like this bug, 1, 2, 3, that's, not the one you're fixing, but I think this had a similar change in the past, or we saw this similar pattern used elsewhere, you'll be able to do that. And so, kind of it's just growing that so that it hits all of these surfaces and makes it feel more natural to be able to, talk about any work that you're doing at any point in that pull request experience.
Yeah, I think there's some questions a lot of people that I encounter have about where to capture certain types of journaling. For instance, when defining a particular new feature, there's features in the work items with comments and whatnot about the discussion that went on to even define it. But then now it's being implemented. So when it's being implemented, is the right place for journaling within the user story or the issue, or is the place for journaling within the pull request? You hear some people, they create their feature branch and then just create the pull request. And then obviously it's not finished until they're finished. But what is the thinking on that from your end?
I would say there's definitely a shift that's happening there, right? And you mentioned that scenario of creating the pull request kind of before the work has even started, right? And I think there's a ton of, my opinion is I think have the conversation happen wherever it needs to happen, right? And that's kind of a generic answer, but let me give you an example. Something I see, we do on our team, and I know customers doing this as well, is, the conversation begins at the beginning of the planning period, right? So maybe somebody creates a feature on their backlog and they say, we want to go add this widget to our website, whatever. There's a lot of questions and conversation up front, even in the design phase, right? When you're kind of understanding what are the requirements, what are the specifications for this feature. And, in our team, we try to keep, I'm a PM, but I work very closely with the engineers and engineering leads on the team. And, we have high bandwidth conversations. We have conversations in the work items, right? Hey, what exactly does this mean? What does that mean? And we'll do those things and capture that as part of that feature work item, right? And there's a lot of value in seeing that evolve over time, right? And we try to do that, like I said, rapidly, and try to do that early before we start coding, having those conversations, understanding what are the details that this work encompasses. So we do capture some of it there. And I think that's a perfectly natural and right way to do it. But then at the same time, when coding starts, the conversation is inevitably going to get pulled into those coding experiences, right? Because that's where the thought, where most of the mind share is going at that point in the life cycle. And, we do the same thing. PMs and engineers are all collaborating and cooperating together to kind of, I don't want to say document, but to journal, like I think is the word that you use there, kind of what's happening and how is this evolving. And, I've seen features change radically in the conversations in a pull request just because, some engineer asks a question about a piece of code and they say, well, why is this done this way?
Yeah.
And then they say, well, the PM at Matt, was saying that we should do it this way. And then we'll talk about it and discuss and inevitably come out with a new outcome. And so it's, if that's the natural way to do it, I think then that's the right and best place to do it. But sometimes the conversation happens entirely outside of, either of those tools.
Right.
We're big users of Microsoft Teams, which, for me, I work remote. It's awesome. It's like the best thing that I could use to keep all my conversation in one place. But, we have conversations there as well. And, we'll use those integrations to, Azure Boards, or Azure, or GitHub or Azure Repos to integrate, hey, this piece of code here, and you're doing the kind of the opposite in a conversation in a room. You're saying, oh, this PR, and you mention it and link it in line and kind of facilitate the conversation that way. So, I hate to say, is there a right way to do it? I think about it as making sure that that conversation is captured somewhere is a good thing, but make it captured in the right format in the right place. And providing all the tooling so that it's easy to reference all of the related artifacts that might be relevant for a discussion. So,
well, that's a good point. If you have requirements and specifications discussion in a work item, and then you have a bunch of technical discussions about implementation trade-offs in the pull request or in Microsoft Teams, what's the level of integration that's going to be there? Have y'all had any long-term discussions about copying all of those and aggregating those in one place so that when you kind of look at everything, it's pulled together? Or do you think that those will continue to live in their own places?
Yeah, it's a good question. The bringing in the external chat tools like Slack or Teams, and it becomes a little bit more challenging in terms of trying to bring all of that into one place. But from the Azure DevOps side, and that's boards, pipelines, repos, GitHub, bringing in those pieces, we certainly have this vision of creating kind of, I would say, a better end-to-end integration of all of the artifacts related in getting a piece of work delivered from idea delivered to the customer, right? It's funny. My lead, Aaron Bjork, great guy. If you haven't talked to Aaron, you should get him on your show at some point.
Yeah, we do have a show with him.
Awesome. Aaron and I have talked about this idea a lot recently, where in code, we talk about the DevOps pipeline a lot as being this thing that starts with a commit, right? So you started with a commit, then you create you're committing on a branch, you're creating a pull request that goes into another branch, into your main line, your master branch, whatever. And then that gets picked up by your CI build. That's kind of the next step in that pipeline. And then it's going to go through various deployment stages. If you've got, depending on how sophisticated your app is, and if you're deploying a live service, you might have deployment rings, things that you're going through as you're scaling out and deploying out progressively to different customers. Those are all phases in this kind of virtual pipeline. But we like to think of that as kind of, from our perspective in the boards team, that's kind of the end of the pipeline. Our pipeline starts when an item goes in the backlog, right? And think about your board. Your board is really like a virtual pipeline in a sense, right? You start with it in this backlog, then it goes to, some new column that represents a piece of work that's going to get planned and spec'd and whatnot. And then it goes into, an active column, which says someone's working on it. When that engineer picks something up out of an active column, they put it into, maybe in progress, or at some point it goes to an in review column. And then from there it goes into, completed. But what does completed mean? Well, that's when that DevOps CI/CD pipeline starts, right? So you can imagine this pipeline as being this one long continuum from backlog through speccing, development, code review, and then completion on the board side becomes pull requests, continuous integration build, CD, or even if you're not doing CD, it's a deployment which rolls out and rolls out and rolls out. And eventually, at the very end, you've got it sent out to your customers. They're, hopefully are their release notes and things published. So if you think about that, that's what we're trying to capture and make sure all of that, that big continuum or that big pipeline of DevOps is captured, and that we can make it so that all those transitions from state to state, if you will, and I use the word state there loosely, but from each step of the process, making sure that that's visible and traceable, and you can get to all of the related things all the way from, conception to release.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's a great answer I forget exactly how you started the question, but hopefully that paints a vision of, kind of the way we're thinking about things right now,
right?
Where we want to go, and how broad we see this, connectedness of, ideas and conversations.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
So then at some point, I would imagine a new project workflow where you say, oh, I want a new project, and use GitHub instead of Azure Repos, and it just all is created, fully hooked up together. Is that planned?
Yeah, that's kind of how we're thinking about it. One of the things that we're working on right now is getting, I talked about our integration that we have today between Azure Boards and GitHub. It requires you to go and have an Azure Boards account. You go and you connect your project to your repos.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to make that work in the other direction as well, right? If you're working in GitHub already and you're looking for a better project management tool, we're going to have an app in the marketplace in GitHub. You'll go to the GitHub marketplace, look for Azure Boards. We'll be there, and you'll say install, just like you can do Azure pipelines today. You'll say install, and it'll install that for you. And then you'll get guided through a flow of, here's my projects and repos and how they connect up. And so when you want to add a new repo, you'll use that same experience that you get in GitHub, where GitHub is aware of the apps that are already installed for other things in your organization. And then you could say, oh yeah, I want to add Azure Boards and Azure Pipelines too. And so that's kind of the way that we see that working. So it'll be, much more first class integrated in terms of that, what the GitHub user is used to, and, creating a repo, and then they just add, of course you want build associated with that. And of course you want to be able to track that work in a board somewhere. And so we're that's kind of the angle that we're looking at it right now, is how do we get that as part of the, that marketplace in GitHub?
So are there any timeframes that you're looking at?
As soon as possible. But seriously though, that's what we're actively working on right now. Is our getting an app out there. It's March right now, right? I guess March 11th.
It is.
We're hoping to get something kind of in the spring here. That'll be publicly available for people to just go and install from there.
Yeah, one of the big things is Office 365 logins.
Yep.
And I guess maybe that's a different identity team to even be able to log in to GitHub with the same account that you log in to Azure DevOps Services. That sounds like a big dependency for your work.
It's interesting. We've actually made it so that it's not really a big dependency for us. That is happening, right? Getting this better integration between, the GitHub and the Azure DevOps properties, if you will, right? And making it so that you can have that one login and log in seamlessly across both. But the way that, we built this integration is that you don't have to have that set up. You can do it right now with your, login. You would log into GitHub with your GitHub credentials, log into Azure Boards with your, Azure DevOps credentials. And that integration will just flow between them. But once we've got that concept of kind of one shared identity that you can log in once across all of those things, it'll just get more seamless. So
yeah, because I'm imagining if you're at mentioning somebody in Azure Boards, you got to remember, okay, what are they called over here? And the at mentioning somebody in a GitHub pull request, and they might be Code Ninja 456 in GitHub. Well, we all created our GitHub accounts so long ago. Who knows what we called ourselves?
No, that's exactly right. And you're right. These are the kinds of investments that I imagine will come over time, where we need to make it truly first class, right? Like and those are the details that make it truly first class, right? Like being able to understand that this person is associated with this profile, and how do we make sure that I can do all of the experiences in a first class way. And you're right, mentioning people is the perfect example of that.
Yeah. So with GitHub being the premier offering intended in the future, and that's the strategic thinking, for people who are doing their internal software, that code is always going to be private. It's not going to be open source, but it is their business system, and they're in Azure Repos right now. From a strategy perspective and all the discussions that are going on, what's the pitch or the future example of, hey, GitHub is the premier offering, and now that it's ready, this is why you should migrate?
Golly, that's interesting. And you're throwing the hard balls at me here now, but I think having I told you at the beginning kind of my my background in the migration space. I've always been a proponent of making sure teams do what's right for them at the right time. Right. And, with software development, that is all, there's almost never a right time these days with, CI/CD and this idea of continuous delivery. When do you cut, when do you break and move something? The one thing that I do want to touch base on, you say about being the premier offering. I don't want people to confuse that with saying, oh, there is no more Azure Repos, right? Because that is definitely a strong offering that we have and we plan to have forever. So what we don't want to do is make people feel this pressure that, oh man, I got to get off Azure Repos, right? And get on to GitHub. At the same time, GitHub, is going to be that premier offering, and we want to kind of make it so easy for people to move over.
Yeah.
So there will be some challenge, and I imagine some, migration tooling at some point to help people move those things over in the most seamless way possible. But I'm trying to think about, go back. Can you phrase that question again for me? I'm trying to think of how you said it. It was,
if GitHub is the premier offering and that's the strategic direction, then I'm just wondering if the future pitch has been formulated yet for, okay, once we're all finished with all the work that makes it the fully connected premier offering, this is what we're intending to tell people about the benefits that make it premier.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of, what is that pitch? I think we're still forming that in some ways, right?
Yeah.
That, and what I mean by that is, yes, we do want that to be the premier thing and all of those services to work great together. And I think it's really about what does each of those components offer to independently first, right? I'll start with, Azure Boards, right? We think we're a mature and very capable project management and work tracking system, right? We've got great boards. We've got great backlogs. We've got great integration with reports and dashboards. And then, so that alone, we want to be kind of the best of breed in that vertical, if you will. GitHub has a really strong code vertical, right? And the thing that GitHub has that can't be understated is the community and ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody's on GitHub. Who doesn't have a GitHub account?
Right.
Every project in open source that's meaningful is on GitHub, right? And as you see teams kind of wanting to evolve their practices in terms of, open source development and collaborative, what we like to call inner source development, especially at larger teams. I think GitHub has a huge offering there that is just the best thing that's out there, right? And so, I talked a lot about this in the VC space when I worked there. Was this people want to have this inside your organization, the same type of collaboration across teams and business units that you see in GitHub in the open source world, right?
Yeah.
And so I think of, you say like, what is the premier offering in the strategy? I think of it as kind of being centered around that core, right? Like all of your coding happens in GitHub. That's your open source projects, your inner source projects, your private isolated development projects. They're all together, right? All the people involved with that, they're all together there, right? And that ecosystem grows out from there, right? And in the board side, we're saying, we will integrate with everything that GitHub does and take advantage of all the extensibility points and APIs and things that GitHub provides for partners, right? I'll give you an example of something that's coming. GitHub has a feature called content attachments, where you can have rich, attachments, they call them, inserted into places where you link to artifacts that live in an external system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is kind of what you'll see growing as part of that premier offering, right? GitHub has this capability. Azure Boards will leverage that capability, and you'll get this super rich discussion in your pull request, where not only do you see that link to something, but now you're seeing some of that work item pulled in first class. You don't even have to go and click on Azure Boards. You'll be able to see it right in line. You'll be able to see a rendering of that work item for you in some form. And same thing with pipelines, right? We imagine kind of those same types of integrations. You see a lot of that happening today, where you go to your pull request and you look at the checks tab, if you will, and you see all of that status there, right? And so it's kind of enriching all of those bonds. And just that, there's so much mind share and activity in the GitHub side of the world that as it grows, will grow and strengthen those bonds between the other pieces.
Okay.
The other piece of kind of that premier offering is the third leg of the triangle, if you will, right? If you imagine boards, GitHub, and pipelines as kind of the three vertices, I talked a lot about how GitHub integrates with boards and pipelines, but not a lot about how boards and pipelines integrate with one another. And that's something that we're actively working on as well. Today, if you're using all three of those together and you go and look at your build report or your build summary, you'll see, these are the work items that were associated with this build by way of the work that, the code that was associated with it. And we're going to strengthen that moving forward by including that all the way through your deployment. So a deployment is usually a collection of builds. That's the way I like to think about it, right? You've done a bunch of different builds, and then at some point you're going to say, let's deploy that work. Well, that aggregates a bunch of work. Well, which work items are being aggregated here, right? And then from the other side of the world is from the work side, seeing what build did this go into, right? And we have had some of this, historically, but as that CI/CD pipeline grows and becomes more important to more teams, we're going to be strengthening those bonds between that and the work, right? So that what some of our dreams there are to be able to say, you'll be able to open up any bug or story or feature or whatever that you're tracking in Azure Boards. Open it up and see, where is it in that development pipeline, right? Mm-hmm. Is it deployed? Is it part of a PR? Is the PR completed? Is it in master? Has it been built? Has it made it into a deployment? Which ring of the deployment is it in? Is it deployed to all my customers or just a subset, right? Like we want to be able to have a quick at a glance way to see that in your work item and know without having to dig into all of these reports, where exactly is it?
Right.
And so hopefully that paints a vision of what I think of that premier offering as being, and it's that three together are better than any one of the pieces alone, right? And so once you're using boards with GitHub with pipelines, you'll have that traceability end to end in all directions, and it'll really strengthen that as a unit together by pulling everything together.
Well, that's a lot of good information. That's because we can only speculate about what the future might hold, and you're living it day in and day out. And what's gonna be there in some form or fashion once it's all figured out down the line.
Right.
So that's awesome. Well, some of the scenarios that seem obvious to me anyway, is customer feedback. Like it's a little bit difficult to open up to customers or maybe individual users feedback, and by giving them access to Azure Boards to create a work item that's a feedback item, because then you're giving them access to the actual work tracking system. But if you let them create issues in GitHub, because GitHub has the whole social coding experiences already worked out, and say, hey, yeah, just create an issue. If you're using the software, here it is, create an issue. And you don't necessarily have to make the source code public to the users if it's private, just to give them a place to create issues around it. And then if there are issues on GitHub, you can pull them into a work item, or so I think some type of social coding or bridging between product management and the actual users, because good ideas come from both sides.
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. I like to, our director PM, Jamie Cool, had said this to me a long time ago, and I'm going to paraphrase, like, it doesn't matter where the idea came from. If it's a good idea, go for it.
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think we were talking about this, kind of being where to source our features set from. We get PMs and engineers, and making sure we're taking all these perspectives in, and the customer is an invaluable perspective. Right. Yeah. And we do this all the time. We've got various feedback sources. We're always looking for what are the suggestions that people have, right? And how does that tie into where we think we're going? And kind of bringing this back to GitHub and issues, and I think you're absolutely right, and we see that, and I've talked to a number of my customers that want to do this. I'll give you a good example: the Windows calculator. Did you see that went
I did.
Open source? Yeah,
I did. That's really interesting. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it's one of those things. It's like, hey, it's been one of those tools that's been around forever in Windows and in the Microsoft world, and I'm pretty sure everybody's probably used it at some point. But that team is a good example where even though they made that source code open source, they want to take that feedback from the community, right? So it's on GitHub, and they have GitHub issues, and they're actually we worked with them because they are using Azure Boards, and they helped build a tool that imports those issues into Azure Boards. And they're also using Azure Boards kind of for their private development and tracking, and they've got a lot of other things that they're doing, but they want issues as that public space where the community can come and get feedback.
Right.
And while that team, they were a little bit ahead of us in terms of where they were going and the timing of what we're doing with Azure Boards and GitHub. But we aspire to have those same scenarios available for everybody in an easy way without having to build a custom tool to do it. So that, you could imagine you go to GitHub, create an issue, and even if your code's private, that it could surface that issue in your related Azure Boards project. And, so that is part of that, that bigger vision too, right? Like we talked a minute ago about what's that premier offering? That I think is a component of that premier offering, right? Having a place for your customer to report things, whether it's public or private code. Why not? Why not do it through a GitHub issue? Right?
Yeah, totally. Well, hey, Matt, before we go, what should our listeners follow up on? They want to kind of dig into more about what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mentioned, the big things coming from my team. From if you're interested in keeping GitHub and Azure Boards integrated, and you haven't maybe used Azure Boards before, but you've used GitHub and you're looking for a great project management tool, keep an eye out for the marketplace offering that we're going to be having at GitHub. So we'll soon have Azure Boards app inside GitHub's marketplace, and it'll be easier than ever to go ahead and download and use that. If you're already using the integration, keep an eye out for kind of that getting richer and more deeply integrated. I mentioned this idea of having work item mentions within your discussions in the PR. We just talked about issues and getting issues integrated, GitHub issues integrated with Azure Boards. That's another thing that we have coming soon as well, where you'll be able to link an issue in GitHub to a work item inside Azure Boards. And then, I think another one that I mentioned was this idea of this content attachments, right? So richer, deeper integration inside the GitHub user experience that'll surface your Azure Boards information more deeply and more naturally as part of your pull request, description and discussions that you have going on. So, and then I'll tease a little bit kind of the next big thing that's on our horizon is that integration in the deployment pipeline, right? So we can do a lot more in terms of how Azure Boards is surfaced as part of your Azure pipeline deployments, and how can you identify at a glance, hey, this work item is associated with that deployment. And yes, this age-old question of, is this bug in production yet? Right? You'll be able to answer that. So that's where we're going over the next few months here, and yeah, it'll be exciting.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much, Matt, for visiting with me. This is a great talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeffrey. I appreciate it. It's a good time.
And until next week, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.